The day was finally here. After a 5-month question bank bender and sketchy binge and 2 weeks of white-knuckled anticipation, my Step 1 exam score was finally in my email inbox. After scoring in the 260s on both UWorld practice forms, I couldn't wait to see my 265 and secure my future as Mars's first interplanetary SpaceX astronaut spine surgeon. I opened the email, clicked on the PDF, and... what? How is this possible? How am I gonna explain this to Elon? My career is doomed! Fortunately for all of you, Step 1 changed to pass-fail, and the study methods needed to score highly and pass haven't changed at all. Studying and performing as well as possible on the Step 1 will also raise the floor of your knowledge base and really prepare you for Step 2 down the road, which is essentially the new Step 1. I'll reveal my lower than expected Step 1 score toward the end of this video. But what separated my score from the 95th percentile score that I was expecting? After doing extremely well on Step 2 just 1 year later, I learned exactly what I would have done differently to get that 265 on Step 1. None of you will need a 265 to pass, but you can glean some of the best practices of studying to pass with flying colors and look like a rock star on your third-year clerkships. So let's get right into it. First and foremost, I recommend getting the 24-month subscription to UWorld for Step 1 on day 1 of medical school or your first basic science block. This may sound like overkill, but the more prolonged and consistent exposure you get to these NBME style questions, the better off you'll be on test day. The added benefit of this is that UWorld cycles new questions in and out of the question bank, so the longer access you have, the more distinct questions that you'll have access to. To be clear, your dedicated study period shouldn't start until up to 6 months before your exam, but you should start preparing a little bit each day during medical school, starting with your first science block. I would have scheduled out a full pass of the UWorld Step 1 questions during each respective block. For example, if I was taking my 6-week biochemistry block, I would have scheduled myself to take at least 4 UWorld practice questions per day to finish the 152 total that are available in UWorld. I would also leave myself enough time before the end of block exam to retake all my incorrects. This strategy also puts you at an advantage for your medical school end of block exams if they're given as NBME subject exams. Ideally, I would have finished close to a full pass of all of the UWorld questions for Step 1 by the time I started my dedicated. Now I know what most of you are thinking.
But Tim, I'm taking Step 1 in like 5 months.
It's totally fine if it's too late for you to start that early, but I'm just telling you what I would have done to maximize my score. However, if your Step 1 is coming up in less than a year and you haven't bought your UWorld subscription yet, I would do that today. Pace yourself to finish 1 full pass of the questions before day 1 of your dedicated. Then you can either start with all of your incorrects or do a hard reset and start from scratch to give you enough time to finish the whole question bank again before your test. Even if you had only 6 weeks to start and finish your Step 1 studying, if your plan was to do a full pass of all 3,600 questions, you got 30% of them wrong, and then did a second pass only of your incorrects, then doing that 1.3 passes of the material would work out to about 111 questions per day. And as someone who did 120 to 160 practice questions a day,
what?
For Step 2, I can tell you that this sounds like a lot, but it's very doable. But since I really believe it's important to get multiple passes of these practice questions, you give yourself the best chance at doing this by starting as early as possible and generating your understanding early and often. A huge mistake I made when studying for Step 1 was I crammed 3 question banks in the 5 months that I was studying for Step 1. This only gave me enough time for 1 single pass of the UWorld bank, which I literally finished like 2 days before the exam. This added up to over 9,200 practice questions. I think given the difference in styles between these question banks, it's not worth it to confuse your brain, distracting you from the way that the USMLE likes to test you. That's not to say that these question banks aren't useful and maybe even a good supplementary resource early on during your first and second year of med school, but if I were to go back, I would have stuck with 1 question bank and I would have picked UWorld. Looking back, I really think quality trumps quantity, and UWorld is truly the gold standard. So this brings me to my next important point, the USMLE Step 1 discipline specifications. A big mistake I made when studying for Step 1 was not studying according to the weight of each discipline. When you check their official website, you can see that the highest yield one by far is Pathology at 52%, followed by Physiology, Pharmacology, Biochemistry, and Microbiology. If I could go back to day 1 of my dedicated, I would calculate my relative room for improvement the way I did for my Step 2. I would use a calculation somewhat like this. and it would be based on the percentile rank of my UWorld disciplines and the percent weight of that discipline on the step 1 exam. This will give me a quantitative measure for which disciplines I can gain the most points on test day. So with that in mind, let's get into the best additional study resources to target each of these high yield disciplines. Starting with pathology. Given that it's the highest yield area to work on, in my opinion, the most valuable step 1 non-UWorld resource is Pathoma, and it's not even close. Pathoma chapters 1 through 3 are incredibly high yield and stacked with the timeless fundamentals that will gain you a lot of points on your exam. A huge mistake that I made was not watching and taking notes on every single video of Pathoma. Pathoma was also really helpful for my basic science blocks in med school. So for Pathoma and all the resources I talk about in this video, this is what I recommend you do. The first time you open a Pathoma video, create a Pathoma notebook in your OneNote or other note-taking app that you prefer, organizing by chapter. Between then and the start of your dedicated, any video you watch should have corresponding notes in this organized notebook. Then when you start dedicated, you'll know exactly which videos you have left to watch and take notes on. This will save you time and make sure that you don't have to rewatch any videos that you forgot to take notes on, and allow you to finish your notes for a complete first pass. Only rewatch the videos if you need a refresher. After you have notes on all the videos, make a second and third pass by reading your notes and rereading your notes, paying special attention to Pathoma chapters 1, 2, and 3. It's 35 hours of video, so make sure to budget out enough time for 3 well-structured passes of this incredibly high-yield material. Dr. Sattar, the author of Pathoma and its corresponding textbook, is a celebrity among medical students because of his talent for distilling complex pathology principles into its most basic elements. Another helpful supplementary resource for learning pathology is Dr. Goljan's pathology lectures, which I talk much more about in my 5 apps to save time video, and you can find a link to that here. These lectures were a really helpful, low-stress way for me to reinforce my knowledge and understanding on my morning and afternoon runs. So this brings me to the second most important discipline in step 1, which is physiology. In my experience, my basic science blocks in medical school covered most of the important concepts needed for physiology on step 1. However, the additional resource I'd recommend is Physiology by Dr. Linda Costanzo. I purchased this one during my dedicated, but didn't get through very much of it because, well, let's just say I don't have the best track record reading large textbooks. But there are many students who knocked step 1 out of the park and attribute a large part of their success to this textbook. It has concise chapter summaries, challenge yourself questions, and sample problems in each chapter that help you really lock in the material and test your understanding. It's a bit of a time investment, so I'd say if physio is your strongest subject and your UWorld physiology percentile rank is off the charts, you can afford to pass on it. But if you need to boost your physiology performance, I'd say Pathology by Costanzo is definitely the way to go. Another solid low maintenance option is to just diligently study the UWorld physiology question explanations after your correct and incorrect answers. Take detailed notes in your OneNote and organize them by organ system. This brings me to the third most heavily tested discipline on step 1, biochemistry, for which I'd actually recommend the biochemistry category of boards and beyond. There's really nothing sexy about this material. You just have to know the metabolic pathways, molecules, vitamins, and lysosomal storage diseases.
Lysosomal storage diseases?
And there's not much else to it. So someone like Dr. Ryan, who gives it to you straight no chaser, is what you really need to get this challenging material locked down. He has practice questions on his website to help you test your recall, which I think is pretty essential for material that's this dense. The biochem section has 28 videos for a total of 9 hours. Really not a bad time investment for a subject that will make up to a quarter of your step 1. And just like for Pathoma, make sure you're taking notes in your OneNote to give yourself a well-structured second and third pass. The next most important disciplines are pharmacology and microbiology, and for these, I can't recommend Sketchy, Pharm, and Micro enough. They associate different characters and images with each concept across all their sketches in a way that helps you integrate the material and remember complex topics very easily. I still remember an exam during my neuro block where I needed to know the mechanism of lamotrigine. A brief, photographic memory recall of Sketchy reminded me that there was a llama sitting next to a spilled bucket of salt, and therefore llama plus salt equals lamotrigine sodium channels. Sketchy is so useful for recall of pharmacology that I even used it throughout my 3rd year clerkships. As far as Sketchy Micro, even though microbio only takes up to 15% of step 1 questions, I found it to be the easiest way to master micro and gain several points on my UWorld blocks. I found myself going from very low to very high micro percentages after just my first pass of the Sketchy Micro videos. And as always, have an organized notebook dedicated to your Sketchy videos for a well-structured second and third pass. pass. It's worth noting that Sketchy also has courses for biochem, physiology, and anatomy. These weren't available when I studied for STEP, so I can't see how they compare to Boards and Beyond and Physiology by Costanzo, but they're definitely worth looking into. So now that we've covered the most important disciplines, let's get into how I would have organized my UWorld incorrect notes the way I did for step 2 using OneNote. So in addition to my Pathoma, Boards and Beyond, Sketchy Micro, and Sketchy Pharm notebooks, on day 1 of my step 1 dedicated, I would have made one final notebook called UWorld Notes, where I would write down a 1 to 2 sentence explanation for each of my incorrect UWorld questions according to the associated discipline. The way I did this for step 2 was during my review of an incorrect, I scrolled to the bottom of the page, saw its associated discipline, went into that page of my notes for that discipline, and wrote my 1 to 2 sentence explanation of what I didn't understand and needed to know to get that question right. Then every morning during breakfast, I would pull out my iPad and review these notes while I was eating, starting with my most important discipline and ending with my least important. While the Pathoma, Boards and Beyond, and Sketchy notes serve as an excellent primary study method, the UWorld notes serve as a rapid review of the miscellaneous concepts that you still have to master during your fast-paced dedicated study period. And of course, we have the practice exams. I did a total of 12 step 1 practice exams, including the CBSE. I did NBMEs 16 through 23, a free AMBOSS test that popped up for step 1, and UWorld Forms 1 and 2. In my opinion, the true value of taking these exams is building your stamina and learning the pacing to prepare you to answer questions confidently in an average of 90 seconds or less. Step 1 is an 8-hour exam with 7 blocks of 40 questions. So since each practice exam is 4 blocks of 40 questions, I took 1.5 exams each week to simulate the length of the actual step 1 as closely as possible. I completed 1 full NBME practice exam, then 2 out of 4 blocks of a second NBME exam. Even though I wouldn't get to find out the score of the second exam until I did blocks 3 and 4, like I said, the real value is getting used to that exam duration. So when you do these practice tests, make sure to have a quiet environment, use earplugs if you have them, turn off or put away your phone, and only take time breaks. Only eat and drink coffee before the exam or during your breaks. You're not going to be able to have a mug of coffee next to you in the testing center. And resist the urge to pause the exam and take unscheduled breaks. This is something I was definitely guilty of, but you won't get to take those breaks on test day. I made this mistake a few times, and I definitely feel like I paid the price a little bit because I wasn't fully trained to answer questions confidently in 90 seconds or less the way I was for step 2. And finally, there's some other important considerations to keep in mind regarding the way step 1 is scored. There's a significant variance of your score for a given fund of knowledge. After taking my final NBME practice test, my score report predicted my score range to be 242 to 258, 2/3 of the time. Even though I went on to score a 264 and a 260, on the UWorld Forms 1 and 2, this prediction actually ended up being correct. Also, the step 1 includes up to 80 experimental questions that do not count towards your score. That could be over 25% of your exam. It's always possible that this could give you a lower score than expected because many of your correct answers were experimental and didn't contribute to your final score. This could be a large contributor to the NBME's wide score prediction range for each test taker. So the most important takeaway from that for you, study hard enough to make sure that a passing score doesn't fall within your 16-point range. So if you made it this far in the video, you've earned the right to learn what my actual step 1 score was. I opened my score report expecting a 260 or higher, but when I clicked on the PDF, I found out that I scored a 244, which is a great score in its own right, but nothing close to the 260 I was expecting. If I stuck to the study strategies and resources that I talk about in this video, I'm really confident that I would have added at least 10 to 15 points to my score. But since step 1 is now pass-fail, you don't need to go in there and put up a 270. I made this video because these are the most effective study strategies and resources that I used, and the pass-fail change shouldn't tempt you to let off the gas pedal and give yourself a chance to score below passing. Hopefully, with the help of these methods, you'll have an outstanding knowledge base going into your third-year clerkships, and you'll be able to pass step 1 with your hands tied behind your back. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, if you have any questions about anything I talked about, or you'd like me to do a video on another topic, let me know in the comments. And for those of you studying for step 1 right now, go crush it for me and report back when you have the good news. Peace.